Hey there, Zach here. It is so good to be back in your podcast feed after our unannounced and unexpected hiatus. As I mentioned in our previous episode, we had a bit of a perfect storm of personal and professional chaos, but hey, we're back now with weekly episodes starting today, and I cannot wait to share with you the guests that we have lined up this season. I'm especially excited about this episode today. We have been sitting on this interview for what feels like months now, and oh my goodness, it is so good. But hey, enough of me talking about the episode. Let's roll that theme music. You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. Our guest today is the research director at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia. He has been particularly involved in the study of mystical and religious experiences, a field referred to as neurotheology. He's published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and chapters on brain function, brain imaging, and the study of religious and mystical experiences. He's published 12 books, which have been translated into 17 different languages, including the bestsellers Why God Won't Go Away and How God Changes Your Brain, both of which I have mentioned dozens of times on this podcast before. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
It is such an honor to have you here to finally get a chance to pick your brain.
Such as it is.
I think longtime listeners of the podcast will recognize your name, even if they haven't read anything that you've written, because I feel like I've mentioned your work 100 times over the past 100 episodes.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
I self-identify as a scientifically minded Christian mystic, and your work has been profoundly important in giving me language to explain why that's not so much of a contradiction, which I'd love to really dive deeper into the mystical aspects in a few minutes. But before we do, can you just kind of briefly unpack the work that you do and how you go about doing it?
Sure. So, you mentioned the term neurotheology, so I'll start with that. The concept of neurotheology is that it is a field of scholarship, a field of research that seeks to understand the relationship or the link between our brain and our religious and spiritual selves. So a couple of important points about that. One is that it is not just a scientific study of religion. It's not just using brain scans to study meditation and prayer and mystics and so forth, although we do that. It's also not a religious evaluation of the merits of science, although that's part of it as well. But ultimately, I really feel like it has to be a true two-way street where you really have kind of the best of what science and technology has to offer, the best of what religion and spirituality has to offer, and find ways of kind of bringing those two concepts together, those two ideas together, to help us to understand who we are as human beings, and particularly the spiritual part of ourselves. And I also think that, you talk about what it is. On one hand, you have the neuro side, and so we use a lot of neuroimaging techniques to study people in meditation and prayer and so forth. But the neuroside to me also is much broader than that. So it's psychology. It can be trying to get at things like the feelings and the thoughts and experiences that people have. It could be anthropological and looking at, sort of different cultures and evolution and all the different ways we kind of, all the different ways that we get at what's going on in our brain and in our body. And then the theology side of the term is obviously a very limited concept as well, in the sense that theology is a specific discipline that looks to kind of unpack and understand the sacred texts and the ideas of a specific tradition. We can do that. We can look at how we address questions such as the nature of sin, the nature of revelation, and what does an understanding of the brain bring to the table when it comes to that kind of discussion. But the theology side also, I think, has to be broadened. So it does include mystical experiences. It includes various practices, meditation, prayer, and so forth. It includes how people believe and why people believe the things that they do. So it really, you have to kind of expand both sides. And I think if you do that, then it becomes a very exciting field that has a specific approach to thinking about things that blends science and religion together, but also, is extremely expansive, as I know we'll be talking about today. But there's so many different ways of trying to get at so many fascinating questions about what religious and spiritual attitudes, beliefs, phenomena, and so forth really mean to us as human beings.
In looking back at the notes I've taken on your books, I think probably the section that I've highlighted the most is the section on rituals from your book, Why God Won't Go Away.
Right.
Particularly because when COVID hit and religious institutions had to kind of shut down and go online, what we found was that a lot of our rituals stopped working. They didn't work so well. They didn't translate so well. In the Christian community, there was a lot of debate and argument about whether or not you can do, say, communion from home. The higher churches who believe that this is literally the body and blood of Christ, they said, well, you can't do that at home with Oreos and coffee. And, the lower churches said, well, of course you can. It's just a ritual. It doesn't, it's just a symbol. It doesn't really matter. And I really found it profound the way that you explained that, there's a couple of really important things to rituals, that it's something that breaks from the norm so that it tells your brain this is something special. And then the sort of rituals that lead us to a higher level of consciousness or a kind of transcendence of our thinking self usually have some kind of aspect of overloading either the arousal or the quiescent systems of the brain. And I know I've explained that in previous episodes, but I'm sure I butchered some of the neuroscience. So I'm wondering if you can help lead us through what's happening in our brains during these sort of really meaningful rituals that we do.
So, well, it sounds like you got it pretty good. And part of why it's hard to mess up to a certain degree is that there's so many different kinds of rituals, and they all do things a little bit differently. But you bring up some really important points too about the whole issue about how modifiable are they, how much they can be translated into other ways of doing it and still maintain the essential elements and ultimately the essential effects that rituals have for people. So, to start with the mechanism by which it works, the very basics of it are that most rituals have some type of rhythmic element to it. And that rhythmic element can be also expressed in different ways and kind of on multiple levels. So there can be the rhythmic elements of the practice itself. You mentioned communion, so we'll take that as an example. But just the pace with which that occurs, the standing up, the walking to the front of the church, the receiving of the wafer and the wine and so forth. I mean, all of that, and then repeating that over and over on a daily basis, weekly basis, yearly basis, generational basis. It's something that, as you mentioned, kind of works. We talk about rituals often. They can be top down or bottom up, and many of the rituals are bottom up, meaning that there's an experience that's kind of coming into us and then ultimately kind of heads up into the brain. And so they can be very calming rituals, and perhaps singing some kind of chant or something like that, or a hymn of a very slow song, then that relaxes us. That the rhythms of the music, the rhythms of the movements will relax us, that quiescent system, as you mentioned. But as that starts to occur, then that ultimately does connect this arousal and quiescent systems that you're talking about, or what's called the autonomic nervous system. And that's really what connects the brain to the body. So in the brain, you have a structure called the hypothalamus, which really sits at the very base of the brain and regulates that arousal and quiescent mechanism. And so if you start with a ritual that's very calming, then you get into these progressive feelings of calmness, ultimately, very profound blissfulness. And then up in the hypothalamus, what can sometimes happen is that there is a kind of a flipping of a switch, if you will. We used to refer to it as breakthrough, this turning on of the other side, of the arousal side. And then that's part of what happens where you get that little, that chill, that feeling, that stimulation that signifies the importance of what you're doing. And then this starts to set off a cascade of changes up into to other areas of the brain, quote unquote, higher areas of the brain. So the limbic system, which is our emotional areas like the amygdala. And so now suddenly, it's not just that you're doing the ritual, but now you feel something, you feel this emotion, you feel a powerful rush of energy, you feel a powerful feeling of love, you sense the meaning and importance of it. And then the limbic system is ultimately connected to the cortical areas of the brain that kind of write this whole thing into your memory. So now, the ideas of the religion, the tenets of the religion of what Jesus means to you, of what, again, just in the Christian context, but this, of course, can be expanded to any tradition. Those fundamental ideas, concepts, they become kind of written into the memory banks of your brain in a very, very intense, very powerful way that as you do it over and over again, it becomes the way you believe, the way you think about the world, and then it gets kind of re-expressed into your thoughts and your behaviors and the ways in which you live your life. And there is this kind of reciprocal action going on. So, you can think about something in your brain and then you feel it in your body, or you can feel it, which is the top down, and then you can feel it in your body and it gets up into your brain ultimately. And of course, we were just talking about the rituals starting with the sort of the calming part of it, but then there's other rituals that are very energizing and very, have very rapid rhythms, and they can be they can drive us in that more energizing way, and then eventually you have this kind of blissful feeling at the end. And so ultimately, with some of the mystical experiences, these very intense spiritual experiences, you get this blend of profound blissfulness, profound energy, and really winds up creating a very intense overall experience for the person that they might refer to as a mystical experience or an enlightenment experience, something like that. But these rituals, as you mentioned, they're extremely powerful. They bind people to an idea. It's not only that you're thinking about it, but you're feeling it in your body, and it also binds people across, the aisle, across across time, across families, across generations, and binds you all the way back, 2,000 years to the very basis of these concepts and these ideas. And to just pick up on the first point that you meant, we talk a lot about in Why God Won't Go Away and some of our other work about sort of the rhythm between permanence and impermanence. Ultimately, rituals do need to sort of be able to adjust and adapt to 1,000 years time. We're different today. We have phones and internet and all that, which they didn't have 2,000 years ago. So clearly, these rituals have changed and adapted. But if they change too much, if suddenly now you have to do communion, online, then it can potentially lose its meaning. And then the question is, at what point? And of course, each ritual and each tradition will have different answers to that question. But at what point does something no longer kind of have the meaning and the value and the purpose that it's supposed to have? And can you either readapt it, or do you actually go in a different direction? And of course, different religions have arisen with the whole Protestant the Reformation and so forth. They went in a different way, and they said, we don't agree with this particular rituals and these particular ideas. We're going to go in a different kind of way, and of course, if that's the case, then it could change the tradition. They were still Christian when they went to Protestantism. They didn't become Muslim, but eventually, if you go far enough, it becomes something completely different. So it's a fascinating aspect of sort of the evolution of the rituals over time, and religions over time. They're not static.
Yeah, you wrote in Why God Won't Go Away that all the great scriptures make the same point. Fundamental truth has been revealed to human beings through a mystical encounter with a higher spiritual reality. Mysticism, in other words, is the source of essential wisdom and truth upon all religions are founded. But before religions can begin, mystical experiences must be interpreted in rational terms, and the ineffable insights they bestow must be translated into specific beliefs. One of my favorite 18th century writers, Thomas Paine, once said that revelation is between God and one person, and then everything else, all religion, is just hearsay. And that's one of the reasons why he died alone. But it strikes me in this sort of post-religious society that we're kind of moving away from that folks are thinking to themselves like, oh, isn't religion just like how somebody else interpreted a mystical experience? Why then should I be bound to something that somebody else had when I can just have my own mystical experience, my own spiritual experience, my own kind of spiritual but not all that religious kind of experience? Is there a value to religion anymore, or is it just kind of an outdated system of control?
Well, yes.
Great question.
I mean, you can deny that dichotomy altogether. And just
well, no, taking kind of a step back in terms of my more larger perspective about things, and we look at so many people coming from different traditions, and even in my world of integrative medicine, we're very much about individualized medicine, and there's two pieces to that. I mean, on one hand, each person does have to find what is meaningful to them. To answer the first part of your question, does religion have value? Of course it does. These traditions are, as my late colleague Eugene DeQuille used to say, are well-winnowed systems. I mean, they have been developed over time. The concepts and the ideas and the rituals, as we were just talking about, have been developed over many hundreds, if not thousands, of years, and of course have millions and millions, if not billions, of adherents. So, there's certainly a value to that, and many people can find, not only the value in the actual tenets and the various ideas that are part of that tradition, but the idea, again, going back to our discussion about rituals, about the connection to a community, the connection to an idea, the connection to a concept that has that has some value. Isn't just something that I made up yesterday, but something that at least has stood the test of time. Regardless of how it came about, 2,000 years ago or longer. So I think that there's certainly a lot to be said for different religious traditions, and when people do come to me and say, what should I do, and what direction should I take? When people come from a particular tradition, if they feel that it had value to them, if they feel that there was, that they have a connection to it, and that connection is still usable and workable and has meaning to them, then that's great, because it does have such a well-developed approach that can be used. On the other hand, there are times where various religions, for a given individual, they don't make sense, and whether it just doesn't make sense anymore, whether there were some specific, they felt that it was forced on them and they just don't see it anymore. Whether, they, in their own explorations, they feel like they need to go in new directions. That becomes the sort of the spiritual but not religious people that we talk about and hear about in the world today. So, and sometimes that has value for people, and that would be something that would be important for them to potentially explore. And there are rituals that can be developed that would have not only a value for a given person, but new spiritual approaches and new spiritual perspectives that come about. So I think that it can work for the right kind of person, and obviously there are lots of people that religions work for, and again that stood the test of time in that regard. But sometimes people need to seek out those new paths, and whether it's another ancient tradition or whether it is something completely new, that's for that particular person's spiritual journey. And but I think the important part, and part of what we really try to emphasize in Why God Won't Go Away and How God Changes Your Brain and the other books that we've written, is that everyone has that sort of desire to seek that kind of a connection, that kind of an answer. But there are, many, many different avenues. And maybe the last way to answer your question, which is something that I say a lot, which is that, part of what I have learned through neurotheology and asking people, we can talk about this a little bit later, but we've done a survey of a couple thousand people's experiences, and while we can find commonalities, there are also, complete distinct, every person's experience is distinct. So on one hand, there are lots of religions out there that people can follow, but I've always said, if there's 7.5 billion people on the planet, there's really 7.5 billion religions. I mean, no two people think about things exactly the same way and have the same exact emphasis that they place on the meaning of a prayer or the meaning of a ritual, the meaning of, whatever their tradition is saying. So everybody, if you canvass 100 people in a church, they're all going to be thinking things a little bit differently. And that's just the nature of who we are as human beings.
So, Andy, I wonder if we could step back for a minute. How is it that you got into this field? Like, I find I've read a little bit about that and I thought it was really interesting, but I'd love for you to just kind of share with us and our listeners what made you go into this field.
Well, it really has been my lifelong journey, and I do consider it a kind of combination of a scientific and spiritual pursuit. Back when I was very young, and first started thinking about these questions about religion and the world and what was true and how we would know it. I was always a little I don't know if disturbed is the right word or just couldn't quite figure it out. Like why if we're all looking at the same world, why aren't we all the same? Why don't we all think the same way? Why are there Republicans and Democrats? Why are there Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus? I mean, why aren't we all just looking at the same world and coming up with the same conclusion? So I said, well, I guess the real fundamental question then is, well, what's real and how do we get to know that? So in my own mind, I said, well, let me think about this a little bit. And my first thought was, well, it's our brain that helps us to think and take in all of this information and try to figure out and put together a perspective of what our world is all about. So I started to look at the brain and neuroscience and try to understand, what neuroscientists have understood in terms of our thought processes, our emotions, our beliefs, our consciousness. But as I kind of went through my training and kind of heading into sort of maybe my college age years, realized that neuroscience seemed to, while it was wonderful and had some tremendous things to say, really it seemed to have some limitations, especially when it came to things like consciousness and some of these very intense and unusual experiences, the mystical experiences that people describe. So I thought, well, maybe I got to look at them from their perspective. So what is a mystical experience? What is something spiritual? What is religion? What do the philosophers have to say? Theologians have to say about these questions? And I started to explore all of that, and certainly studied that a lot in college, and looked at a variety of philosophers and so forth. So all of this was kind of swirling in my own mind. And eventually, when I entered into medical school, I had this incredible fortune of meeting up with two mentors who were just wonderful. One of them was the person that taught me about neuroscience and neuroimaging and got me started in doing brain scans of all different kinds of neurological and psychiatric issues and problems that people faced. But I also connected with this Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist and an anthropologist by training, and he had been asking questions similar about the nature of religious experience and practices and rituals, actually from the early 1970s, really. And so he and I started to really try to figure out exactly what was going on in the brain. but we were kind of basing that off of old data. And eventually, as I always like to say, the light bulb went off, and I said, well, if we're studying the brains of people, if we're studying Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and depression and so forth, why can't we study religion and spirituality and look at practices like meditation and prayer using these same imaging techniques? And that's exactly what we wound up doing. And then, developing more detailed, robust ideas about what's going on in the brain during these rituals and different practices, and just continue to expand the information that we could learn about, asking questions. We decided that it was so fundamentally important to not just do the brain scans, but you have to really take stock in what a person is thinking and feeling when they have these experiences. And so we ran an online survey to ask about people's experiences, and we didn't want to just take the Mother Teresa's and the Buddha's perspective on all these experiences, but what does the regular person feel? And that's we had the ability to look at all of that. So and as I went through all of this, it was very much a kind of personal contemplative process as well. It became very much of a kind of meditative approach, contemplative approach that really, in my view, kind of combined what the spiritual perspectives and the philosophical perspectives were, the scientific perspectives, and in my own mind, whether I'm ultimately right or not, I'm not sure, but I keep feeling that to get to the answer to that first question that I had about what's the nature of reality, the best way to get to that answer is going to be to have some kind of combination of science and spirituality, that if you kind of put them together in some way, that's going to be our best opportunity to get to an answer to that fundamental question.
So have you faced any pushback in the scientific community for your work? Have there been those that, because I've heard in some of your other interviews you've done and talks you've done, you've talked about the importance of the rigor of science, which I highly value, and I was really happy to hear you say that. And so I'm just curious, with your work, has anyone in the scientific community throughout your career really pushed back on that, saying, how can you study the impact of religion on the brain or anything like that?
Well, early on, certainly, certainly some of my mentors and people who cared about me said, be careful, don't commit academic suicide or whatever. But, I have tried, and I'm sure I have not been fully successful, but I have tried to do what you were talking about. I tried to make sure that the science that we use is good, as rigorous as possible. We're always kind of pushing the envelope. So whenever you do these kinds of studies, there's all. I've gotten fascinated by the whole methodological challenges. If you're going to study prayer, how do you study that? How do you bring somebody in? Can you shove them into a scanner and tell them to pray and hope that they do it the right way? How do you know what they're experiencing? So there's a lot of really interesting. I don't know how much everybody else is excited about it, but to me, I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and in there, I spend a lot of time talking about methodological issues, and that includes things like definitions. Even how do we define what prayer is, what meditation is? How do we study it? What are the best approaches to use? How do we think about these kinds of questions? How do we get the qualitative data that we need? How do we get the objective data? How do we merge them together? I think that while certainly there's always going to be people really on both sides, on the very profoundly religious side as well as on the very scientific side, who may question what's the value of doing this. Obviously, if you're a deeply religious individual, it doesn't really matter what's going on in your brain. It may be nice to know, but obviously, and I appreciate that. It doesn't change. If I say that your brain, your amygdala lit up, that doesn't mean that your belief in God is right, wrong, false, true. It's just a biological correlate. On the other hand, from the scientific perspective, sometimes people are like, well, what's the value in doing something like this? But I think that, again, I hope that I have been able to walk that line and kind of, not make too many, overly biased conclusions about the work that I do. to help people kind of recognize the value of the religious and spiritual side in people. I think in today's world, we recently wrote a book called Brain Weaver about sort of brain health, and we talk about the different dimensions of the human person. We have a biological, a social, a psychological, and a spiritual. And so, many doctors and healthcare providers are recognizing the value of that spiritual side of people in helping to heal them. I mean, obviously, you may still need to give them an antibiotic or chemotherapy or whatever, but they're going to pray and they're going to turn to their religious tradition to help them with coping. And if by turning to their religious tradition, they manage the side effects of the chemotherapy better, you can give them better chemotherapy, they have a better outcome. So there's potential value in understanding this. Certainly with COVID, there's been so much in the way of stress and the various issues that have come up in terms of dealing with the pandemic on so many different levels, and thinking about where the spiritual piece to that comes in. So I think, far and away, and maybe I'm naive, but I have not seen a lot of people, be extremely, negative either way. And most people, I think, because I am open to both sides, and I feel that both sides have a great value, kind of appreciate it. And I mean, part of what's been exciting to me in doing this whole area of neurotheology is I have given talks to very religious groups. I've given talks to atheist groups. I've given talks to psychiatrists and radiologists and philosophers, and so it's been exciting to me, because I think there's a piece of this that every person can kind of take away in terms of thinking about their own ideas, their own beliefs, whether they have a more traditional view of religion, whether they have something that is a more novel, more individualized approach, whether they feel that they don't believe in anything supernatural, but certainly have a connection to nature or to the scientific world or whatever. I mean, there's so many different ways of expressing this piece of ourselves, and that to me is where I hope the value of what I do comes into play.
Yeah,
and you have a very good way of expressing that I think helps to not ruffle too many feathers.
I try. I mean, I do feel that there's a value for everyone, and it's important to reach to where people are and hope that. In the grander scheme, I hope this helps to bring us together, helps us to appreciate each other's ideas and beliefs. And I just did a piece for a newspaper in Kiev about the political beliefs between Ukrainians and Russians, and it starts with discussion. It starts with learning about each other, and
right.
I'm not naive to think that that's suddenly going to end the war, but if you don't talk, then you get nowhere. So you got to at least start somewhere.
How do you make that connection to a newspaper in Kyiv?
Well, they were. It was a lot about beliefs. What do people in Russia believe about the war and its importance and its value? What do people in Ukraine believe? And obviously there's a deep conflict there, and how do you get back past that? It's not that dissimilar from deeply religious groups that have great animosity towards each other, and it goes back to the ritual discussion. Actually, I mean, that was part of the conversation, which is that as Jean DeCrilly and I used to say all the time, and I think it's in Why God Won't Go Away. We said that rituals are a morally neutral technology, which is that they can be used towards great good. They can bring humanity together. They can bring a group of people together. Or they can create great animosity and hatred by saying this is our group, the in group, and everyone who is not of that group is evil, bad, whatever label you want to put on that, and we've got to go out and get rid of them. And I mean, we use rituals all the time in sports and in the military. It's loaded. And in academia. So again, the rituals can be very powerful. Certainly, what they do is they bring people together. But it's the who's in that group and how do you feel to the people in the group versus how do you feel to the people outside of the group. I mean, you could have a small group of 10 people, and if their belief system is that we're connected to all of humanity, then then they can love all of humanity. You could have a small group of 10 people who say, what we believe is the truth. It could be like a cult, and we believe is the truth, and everyone outside of us, are just complete idiots and morons and evil human beings, and we've got to get rid of all of them. So it really just depends on sort of how that belief system is constructed and how the rituals are developed around that belief system that leads people to a very open and loving and compassionate perspective to other people, or a very angered and hateful kind of perspective. And part of what I hope comes out of the neurotheology research as we go forward is to understand those differences and what leads people down that path of very negative, hateful kinds of rituals, so that we may be able to find pathways back to more openness and more ways of being understanding and compassionate with other people who don't believe the way we do.
I think it was in one of your books, and you might correct me otherwise, that you mentioned that in nearly all true mystical unitive experiences, there is a sensation of oneness with all, a sort of peace, a joy, a love, an all-encompassing usness as opposed to me-ness. And but when you have an experience that is almost there, but not fully there, then you get the kind of semi-transcendence, but you never transcend the ego fully. And then you end up with a kind of religion that is really focused on in-groups and out-groups. And it's like it's almost there, but it's almost dangerous to be almost there, but not fully there. Am I...
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is, again, part of what we're trying to kind of, tease out and unravel. But you said it perfectly. I mean, the idea that as we talk about a unitary continuum, and we have a very fragmented view of the world on one far end, and it's just us, me versus everything else, and everything else has its own distinctiveness, to me and my friends, so there's a little bit of connectedness there. Me and my group, who my friends are part of. It could be a church, it could be a sports team, it could be a country, and it kind of keeps expanding, and then ultimately all of humanity. All of the universe, whatever. And but yeah, I mean, I think that there is an interesting issue or problem there that can happen, which is that when people feel that deep sense of oneness, which is, I think, a very when you have that deep sense of oneness, which is that very core sort of feeling, that there may be something that winds up being very problematic if it is not of all of humanity, and if it does foster a more us versus them mentality, instead of something which is a very inclusive, very very compassionate and open way of looking at the entire world. So again, it does. That is more likely in the kinds of experiences that don't become fully a sense of oneness. But even there, I mean, they could still be, again, it's not just the experience, but it's the beliefs that are encompassed within that. And so even if you don't have this intense, absolute unitary state, you can still have a sense of openness and compassion for others. But I would think that those states are more likely to foster a feeling of us versus them, as opposed to the sort of the truly enlightening kind of experiences where, we talk about this in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, where those experiences that are the most intense, when they have that complete sense of oneness, that you do get that, as you said, that sense of joy, that sense of compassion, that sense of overall connectedness with all of humanity, or with God, or with the universe in a very profound way that really gets beyond that us versus them concept.
I really appreciate the fact that a lot of these conversations are exactly the sorts of conversations that people in almost every religious tradition have had for thousands and thousands of years. It's just that it just has different language. The way that I teach, I try to explain the practice of meditation to people. I found best comes from the medieval work, the Cloud of Unknowing, where the author says that you need to imagine that you are positioning yourself under the cloud of unknowing, this sort of unachievable gap between you and the divine that you will never fully grasp with your cognitive self. And you must position yourself there and then put underneath of you a cloud of forgetting that is able to eliminate the world below while you're in this situation. And that's the harder one, getting your brain to forget the things around you while you thrust your spear of pure love and intention into the cloud of unknowing, expecting a response that will transcend the ability to explain what it is. But that it's through that experience of pure love that a person experiences the most truth that they will, and so I hear that sentiment expressed in so many religions, and I hear it expressed in your work. I mean, and being able to see what is happening in a brain when that kind of experience is happening. Mm-hmm. I know for like many mystics and whatnot out there, they go, well, I don't care what it looks like. I know what I'm experiencing. Right. But for me, it gives me a kind of validation that there is something different happening, and that the experience of that is different than the experience of psychosis. And
right.
Right. And that's a little bit of validation for me that what I'm doing is not just, psychotic, but that there's something different. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, you raised some really interesting points, which even delve into my own personal experiences as well. That, on one hand, you're right. I think there's value in understanding the brain and these kinds of experiences, these kinds of states. They teach us about our consciousness. They teach us about how we can actually understand these states. And what this continuum is, and you can get into a question of, well, does the unitary continuum, if that's something that we want to say exists, but then maybe there's an emotional continuum, maybe there's a compassionate continuum, maybe so do they all move together? Can they move separately, apart? And again, what's going on? How does our knowledge of the brain help us with that? But again, neurotheology is also about just asking the questions. What do people actually feel and experience? So if we lined up 100 people who said, I felt a complete sense of oneness in the universe, okay, great. Then let's ask them, well, how did you feel about the compassion for other human beings? How did you feel about this? How did you feel about that? And see how those different aspects of their ideas and their beliefs were changed or affected by the experience. And so, part of the science piece of it doesn't have to be the hard brain science, but just how we ask questions about what the nature of these experiences are. And you also made me reflect a little bit on Ian's earlier question about sort of how I got started in all of this. And the one thing I didn't mention yet, but in my book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, I talk about my own personal experiences that I've had along this, along my path. And part of what was going on when I was talking about this idea of, how do we know what's real and what things can we use, the science, the spiritual, and so forth. In my own mind, one of the approaches that I ended up taking as I kind of went through my college years was a little bit of reminiscent of Descartes, although at the time I didn't know what Descartes was doing. It was before I read Descartes, but then I realized that there was certainly a similarity there. That I said, well, if there's something that I can't fully understand, I'm not going to reject it out of hand, but I certainly can't accept it either. So in my own mind, I said, well, I'll put it aside. I'll say I doubt that it's doubted at the moment. I don't know for sure, and let me keep moving on. And so I started with science and started to think about the brain and consciousness and different ideas and logic, and then I moved into philosophy and theology and so forth. And I kept feeling that there were, our thoughts, our feelings, everything that I was processing, I really felt like it was very problematic. There was no way for me to truly kind of know what it was that if what I was thinking was really true or accurate. And finally, when I was in between my college and medical school, I decided I really wanted to see if I could figure this out before I launched into this whole medical thing. And so, I spent most of that summer really in kind of very deep contemplation and focusing on these kinds of questions and what I could know. And the experience that I had, which for lack of a better term, I refer to as infinite doubt, was an experience where it was basically that there was nothing that could be known, and that I couldn't even know that, and and it was sort of this infinite regressive doubt. And when I've told people that, and they say, well, that must have been horrible, because here you were trying to find the answer to your question about what's real, and you came to the conclusion that you'll never know. It wasn't that just, did you want to just jump out the window at that point? And I said, well, oddly enough, and kind of to your point about the cloud of unknowing, to me, it was actually the most calming and kind of most powerfully sort of unifying and relaxing kind of experience I had ever had, because it sort of took the angst away from that whole search, and it kind of took me to a different way of thinking about it. And so for me, it was something where I felt like I could continue the journey and continue the search, but it didn't have that level of angst anymore, and that it sort of allowed me to explore it in a more freer kind of form. But it had other elements of it, which was kind of interesting, because this infinite doubt was infinite, so there was this sort of unifying element. Everything was doubted. My sense of self was doubted, so that kind of went away, so to speak. And in my own mind, it was I really didn't fully understand what this experience was about, but that was also what then compelled me to want to seek out what other people were saying about these experiences that they had that they referred to as spiritual or mystical or whatever, and whether, is the oneness that they're talking about, was that the same or different from the kind of experience that I had? Was the unknowingness, or was the connection, or whatever was part of these experiences, how did that relate back to my own personal experiences? And so, and yet again, it's still my ongoing pursuit. I still go to that place, and I have some ideas about what to do with that. And, I'm still working on it. And I always tell everyone, if I ever figure it out, I'll make sure I let everyone know. But it to me is still kind of I'm not going to keep that kind of good information to myself, but that's why, again, to me, it's still this sort of very hybrid, integrated, combined approach that keeps looking for the answers, but does so in this other kind of context, which is okay, and I feel like I've learned so much by just going down the journey. Not to be trite, but the journey has become far more important in many ways than the ultimate outcome. Although maybe there will be an ultimate outcome at some point, but at this point, I'm just along the ride.
Yeah.
Infinite doubt is, I think I will, I'm going to use that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I find so much
I think it's going to be
in that as well.
A future book at some point, but I have to figure it out yet.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. It reminds me of Thomas à Kempis, who should be Saint Thomas à Kempis. I have a whole thing about that. They exhumed his body and they found nail marks on the top of his coffin because they had accidentally buried him alive. And they said a true saint would have accepted death, so he doesn't get to be a saint, which is bogus. I need to file a complaint with the Pope. But he writes in The Imitation of Christ that it is better to feel contrition than be able to define it. And that this idea that there is a sort of experiential knowing that transcends the ability to define the knowing. So if you have this infinite doubt, it's almost better to live in that cloud than it is to be able to say, all right, now my doubt is solved and settled, and here's the answer. Because then you're not feeling the contrition. You're just being able to say what it is. I'm wondering if you have done any research into ways of kind of bypassing all of the hard work of having to learn how to meditate and be, super holy to get to that place. If there's any validity to, hallucinogenic drugs or things like I personally find that sensory deprivation tanks are kind of like a way of going from 0 to Zen in 30 seconds.
Very quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you done any research into that, and does that cheapen the experience?
Well, so I haven't done any of the actual sort of work with psychedelics, although I mentioned in our survey of spiritual experiences where we got about 2,000 people, we use that information. We have a new book coming out, which is going to be called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, which is a purposeful takeoff on William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, but with a 21st century update and talking about, what the nature of these experiences are and what we've learned over the last 100 years in terms of the brain. And part of what has been a very valuable aspect of this survey is we ask people, the circumstances within which or upon which these different experiences occurred. And one of the articles that we did publish was a differentiation between those experiences that were had under the influence of a psychedelic compound versus, quote unquote, more naturally occurring experiences. And there was a great deal of similarities. And so, part of the results of that data suggests that those kinds of drugs can induce spiritual experiences that can be, at least seem to be as powerful, or at least potentially as powerful as the more naturally occurring ones. Now, to me, this is part of sort of the larger puzzle, if you will, of what neurotheology is about. So we can talk about the regularly occurring, the naturally occurring, whatever, I hate to use that word, but, the more naturally occurring spiritual experiences with people, in meditation, in prayer, in retreats and so forth, in church, and the kinds of experiences that they have and what they mean and how they occur and so forth. The effects of different psychedelic compounds, I think, also has value. Part of the value of them is that we know where a lot of these psychedelic compounds go. We know that they affect the serotonin system, or they affect, the opiate system, or whatever that they do. But we know, what they're affecting in the brain. So we can say, well, was that, how similar or dissimilar was that experience? And does that tell us something? And you mentioned sensory deprivation chambers. There's been work done with devices that emit different magnetic fields and electromagnetic waves at different parts of the brain and can induce, a feeling of a presence or a feeling of connectedness or something like that. There are people who have seizure disorders who have unusual spiritual experiences. You had mentioned earlier about, how do we know if we're, when we have somebody has a mystical experience, if they're psychotic or not? And certainly there are schizophrenics who have claimed to be, the Messiah and so forth. So all of these are incredibly valuable and important because they are another piece of that puzzle. They're trying to help. If somebody has a seizure disorder and has unusual spiritual experience, well, where's the seizure occurring? Why is it that if they have it in their temporal lobes, particularly in their hippocampus or amygdala, that they're more likely to have that kind of an experience? Does that tell us that the amygdala and the hippocampus are important? And what does it say? And then what do all of these experiences say about the realness of these experiences? And this to me is a really important point. So the analogy that I always like to use is that when you can see, and I don't know if the people who are listening to the podcast will have the video feed, but I wear glasses. So when I wake up in the morning, it's a very blurry world, and I put my glasses on, and the world is clear. Now, the world didn't change, and in some sense, my brain didn't change, but I see the world differently. So, who's to say that if you have a seizure disorder or schizophrenia or take a psychedelic compound, that you actually sort of change, you're sort of putting glasses on your brain and that you're seeing a spiritual world, a spiritual realm in a way that you were not able to see when you were, just kind of walking around. And of course, shamanic cultures around the world often took different, magic mushrooms and things like that. They didn't see it as artificial. They saw it as just the window, the doorway into getting into that spiritual realm. So in terms of the actual realness, while we sort of have our Western biases, you took that psilocybin and so it must be an artificial experience or something like that. It could be, it could be that it's just a purely artificial experience, and that may say something about all these experiences, or maybe it is a way of getting your brain to a state that it didn't have the ability to do before, and that maybe it is a more real experience. And of course, that's always been the data that we come away with in our surveys, and even what we talked about in Why God Won't Go Away, that when people have these intense mystical experiences, not only do they have the experience and whatever elements or core pieces of the experience do they have, but it is perceived by the individual as being more fundamentally real and representing the more the more fundamental reality than our everyday experience. And we get into in several of our books about these epistemic states. How do we see the world? And the sense of being more real is can be a little confusing to me. What does that mean? It's more real. The easy example that everyone has experienced is the difference between the dream state and the everyday state. So when you're in a dream, no matter how real it feels, and some of our dreams have felt, for everybody, I'm sure, has had very real, feeling dreams. But then you wake up and you immediately say, no, that was an inferior version of reality. This is the real reality. When people have mystical experiences, they do the same thing, but now it's the mystical reality that is perceived to be kind of the real reality, and then the everyday reality is then the illusion, or at least isn't quite the full real sense. It bothers me sometimes when people say it's an illusion. I don't know if that's quite the right way of thinking about it, but at the very least, it's not perceived to really represent the underlying fundamental nature of reality, and that also gets back to why I study these experiences, because to me, I find it fascinating that people say, I have this experience and it was more real than every other experience I've ever had. I think we need to take a serious look at what that means. Doesn't mean that it is or isn't, but it certainly is something that should carry some weight in terms of how we evaluate it.
Yeah. Well, I feel interesting. I must say, for those listeners out there, follow your local laws. Don't don't go out and get some illegal drugs to. Right. Yeah. We do not condone illegal drug use. However, if you find yourself a float spa and you can do some sensory deprivation work, I cannot speak highly enough of it. Mm-hmm. But here at the end of our time together, is there anything that you would like to impart to our listeners? Anything you want them to take away from our conversation?
Well, hopefully they've learned a little bit about what neurotheology is, or at least a little bit more. And, I so much appreciate your interest in my, the work that I've been involved in over the years. I personally obviously find it very fascinating, very passionate about it. And I do hope that all the listeners, can kind of explore their own ideas, their own beliefs, to kind of take a little bit of an analytical view, this sort of neurotheological, so when I do communion, when I read the Bible, when I go out and do charity, what's going on inside of me? What's happening in there, and why is that, is that meaningful, and is it relevant? I mean, ultimately, whatever religious or spiritual perspective one takes, as it affects your thoughts and feelings and experiences and behaviors, how do we think about that? And why is it that if we decide to be more religious, we feel that it's important to be charitable, it's important to go out and help our fellow human beings, or it's important to be open to other ideas, whatever it is that we feel. Why did we go in that direction? And I think it's always important for people to reflect on the beliefs that they have, and challenge those ideas and challenge those beliefs, and hopefully bring in these new perspectives, the scientific as well as the spiritual. I think you mentioned this earlier. It doesn't eliminate any of the beliefs or perspectives, but it just gives us a new way of thinking about them that we never had before, and being able to use that information and to explore what all of this means for us as human beings, and how it affects our biology, our psyche, and ultimately our world. That to me is where I think all of this information can ultimately take us. And so I hope that this information is a useful part for every listener out there who's on their own spiritual path and continues to explore the profound questions that we as human beings confront.
And if any of our wonderful listeners want to learn more, I would invite you to check out andrewnewberg.com, where you can read all kinds of articles and get links to books and so much more than we had time to talk about today. So I want to thank you, Dr. Newberg, for being here with us today, for enlightening us and helping us to understand these just incredible truths.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure doing it.